Daniel Carter cruised through his affluent neighborhood in a sleek black BMW, a symbol of his hard work and accomplishments. As he drove past the manicured lawns and sprawling mansions, he felt a surge of pride. He had made it. Little did he know, this day would challenge everything he believed about justice and equality. Officer Sarah Jenkins patrolled the streets, her gaze sweeping over the pristine homes. A nagging feeling tugged at her mind, casting shadows over her perceptions. When Daniel's car came into view, something about it didn't sit right with her. She squinted, her instincts kicking in as she signaled for him to pull over. The flash of red and blue lights in Daniel's rearview mirror jolted him from his thoughts, and his heart raced as he guided the car to the curb, unaware of the ordeal that was about to unfold. As Sarah approached the vehicle, her demeanor was tense, hands resting on her holster, a clear indication of her readiness for confrontation. Her presence exuded suspicion, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air, thick with anticipation. "License and registration," she demanded, her voice sharp and laced with an edge that suggested this was more than just a routine traffic stop. Daniel complied without hesitation, his movements deliberate as he retrieved the documents from the glove compartment. He handed them over, acutely aware of the officer's scrutinizing gaze. Her eyes flickered between his face and the luxury vehicle he occupied. "Is this your car?" she asked, incredulity lacing her tone. "Yes, ma'am. I just bought it," Daniel replied, his voice steady but tinged with confusion. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her disbelief palpable. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered, her grip on her holster tightening. Daniel's heart sank. Confusion morphed into fear as he took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "May I ask why?" he inquired, his tone respectful but strained. "We receive reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description." "Now, step out," she insisted, her voice hardening. The accusation felt like a punch to Daniel's gut, igniting a fire of indignation within him. He slowly opened the car door, acutely aware of the curious neighbors emerging from their homes. Drawn by the commotion, their eyes moved between him and the officer, a mix of concern and judgment painted across their faces. As Sarah began to pat him down, her touch felt rough and impersonal. "Pretty nice ride for a young man like you," she remarked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "How could you afford something like this?" That question struck Daniel like a dagger. It was clear this encounter stemmed from the color of his skin, and the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood was suffocating. He fought to maintain his composure, his mind racing between asserting his rights and avoiding any action that might be perceived as resistance. Sarah, sensing the growing audience, doubled down on her authority. "Spread your legs," she barked, kicking at his feet to widen his stance. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, drawing strength from within. When he opened them, he met her gaze with steady determination. "Officer," he said, his voice calm yet assertive, "I'd like to call for assistance. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "What assistance do you need?" Sarah shot back, her posture rigid. Daniel glanced at the neighbors he had known for years, hoping for support. Mrs. Thompson, a familiar face from across the street, stepped onto her porch, arms crossed tightly, her brow furrowed as she took in the scene. "Nearby, mister." Patel leaned against the doorframe, his expression uncertain. Their hesitance felt like a betrayal. And as he stood there with hands raised, Daniel realized he was utterly alone. The weight of that realization bore down on him as he fought the urge to shout, to defend himself against the injustice unfolding before him. "Sir, I need to see some identification," Sarah insisted, her voice rising with agitation. The gathered neighbors exchanged glances, their reactions a mix of judgment and indifference. Daniel felt the pressure of their eyes, the weight of their assumptions pressing down on him. "Officer," he said, his voice steady, "I've already told you this is my car. I live here. I'm not reaching for anything until you tell me why I'm being detained." The tension hung thick in the air as time stretched on. Daniel made a decision, feeling the pain of isolation. He slowly reached for his phone, holding it up. "I'm calling for assistance. I want to ensure my rights are protected." Sarah tense, instinctively reaching for her weapon. "Put the phone down. You don't have permission to make any calls." The atmosphere crackled with tension, the neighbors leaning in as the situation teetered on the brink of escalation. Daniel's finger hovered over the screen, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity. He was fighting for the countless others who had been wronged by a system that too often failed them. Just then, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and another police cruiser pulled up. A superior officer stepped out, his expression stern as he approached the scene, exuding an air of authority that Daniel had hoped would bring resolution. But as the officer surveyed the situation, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't a rescue. It was a solidification of his nightmare. "Another one trying to push his luck," the superior officer remarked, his tone dripping with condescension. Daniel's heart sank. This man wasn't here to help. He was here to compound the injustice. As Daniel looked to the sidelines for support, he saw only judgment in the eyes of his neighbors. Their faces, once filled with confusion, now bore expressions of satisfaction or indifference. It was as if the arrival of the police had confirmed their suspicions, and Daniel felt the crushing weight of isolation. The superior officer leaned in towards Sarah, speaking just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Delay and radio in for backup. We need to make sure this doesn't escalate." What did they mean by escalate? Daniel hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't done anything wrong, but the calmness in the superior officer's voice sent a terrifying message. He was not just a suspect. He was a threat that needed to be neutralized. "Requesting additional units to my location," Sarah said into her radio, her voice almost gleeful. "We have a potentially dangerous suspect." Dangerous? Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't done anything to warrant this treatment. He took a step back, acutely aware of the growing crowd around him. Their silence felt deafening, and he was acutely aware that he was utterly alone. The arrival of more officers seemed to solidify the reality that he was not just facing a traffic stop. He was facing an entire system that had already decided his fate. As the second cruiser pulled up, Daniel felt the walls close in around him, a trap that threatened to swallow him whole. "Now!" With four officers surrounding him, Daniel felt the grip of panic. The tension in the air was suffocating, and he could feel the judgment radiating from the onlookers. Their eyes bore into him, and he could sense the whispers that accompanied their stares. "Put the phone down," one of the new officers ordered, his hand resting on his holster. "You don't have permission to record." Daniel's grip tightened around his phone, realizing it was his only lifeline. He hadn't intended to record, but the thought of documenting this moment became vital. Before he could respond, the superior officer moved closer, his hand on his radio. "We're not going to let you film us. You think you can use this against us? Not this time." Daniel's heart raced as fear washed over him. The implications of the officer's words sank in. This was about more than just a traffic stop. It was about erasing his existence, his story. Panic surged within him, and he felt the instinct to flee, but he knew any sudden movement could be fatal. "Comply or we'll make this a lot harder for you," the superior officer warned, his voice cold and devoid of empathy. Daniel felt trapped, every instinct screaming at him to fight, yet knowing he was alone in this battle against the tide of prejudice. Just then, Officer Davis, who had arrived in the second cruiser, stepped forward, his demeanor noticeably different. "Wait a second," he said, looking between the others. "I've seen you before," he added, his gaze focused intently on Daniel. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice thick with urgency. "I'm not a criminal. I'm a college student. I go to law school. I live here." Davis's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You're Daniel Carter, right? I remember you from a community event." "Yes. I spoke at my kid brother's career day last month," Davis continued, his tone more relaxed. Daniel felt a glimmer of hope, a chance for reason to prevail. But Sarah, still rigid, interjected. Don't care where he's been. He fits the description. He's driving a car that looks just like the one reported stolen last week. Davis shook his head, determined to dig deeper. This doesn't add up. Let's check his plates again. The superior officer nodded, but Sarah remained tense, her anger palpable. The years of bias she had internalized clouded her judgment, and Daniel could see the struggle within her. As Officer Davis checked the registration, Daniel's heart raced. The tension seemed to hang in the air like a storm waiting to break. Finally, Davis returned with the results. The car's clean. Registration checks out, he stated, and Daniel exhaled, the weight lifting slightly from his chest. But Sarah's glare remained fixed on him, her anger barely contained. I told you he was suspicious, she retorted, as if the results were somehow irrelevant. The superior officer sighed, rubbing his temples. Looks like we made a mistake here. You're free to go, sir. But Daniel wasn't finished. You think this is sorted out? He asked, his voice steady. You targeted me because of the color of my skin. You didn't bother to check the facts. You just assumed. The neighbors, who had watched in silence, began to murmur among themselves, the reality of what had just transpired settling over them. To everyone's shock, Sarah's demeanor shifted as tears welled in her eyes. I was just doing my job, she stammered, her voice trembling. No, Daniel replied, his tone firm yet measured. You weren't. You were being racist, and now you'll have to live with the consequences. In the aftermath of that fateful stop, the community began to confront the biases that had long been buried beneath the surface. Daniel's experience ignited conversations about race, prejudice, and accountability. For Sarah, the moment became a turning point, forcing her to reevaluate her beliefs and confront the toxic legacy of her past. As the neighborhood moved forward, united in their shared experience, they recognized the need for change that would ripple outward, affecting the fabric of their community. The echoes of that day would resonate for years to come, reminding everyone that assumptions carry weight, and the fight for justice is a journey that requires courage and understanding from all.